Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for attending our very first episode of the Peaceable Kingdom Hour, or if you're later viewing. My name is Matthew A. King, and I will be your host. This live stream is made possible in collaboration with allcreatures.org, leading the way in faith based vegan animal rights since 1998, and with the Christian Animal Rights Association, a non denominational Bible based ministry. All opinions and teachings expressed in this series are the commentaries of me, Matthew A. King. And a little bit about me before I start. I'm the president of the Christian Animal Rights Association, which I co-founded with my wife, Nina. And then I've also written several publications that focus on the intersection between Christianity and animal rights, including the books I Will Abolish the Bow, Christianity, Personhood and the End of Animal Exploitation, as well as Pride Goes Before Destruction, Human Vanity, Animal Agriculture, and the New Covenant Solution. And then I'm also a registered nurse, and so I've written a health and vegan focused book titled Meet the New Cigarette, Patient Advocacy in the Plant-Based Diet. And our very first teaching is titled The Garden of Eden. I thought there was no better place to start than Genesis 1. But the Garden of Eden, it's a very important place to understand theologically, and the idea of it becomes something that is repeated throughout the Bible, and so I wanted to focus on that especially. And today, with this teaching agenda, I want to focus on how humans and animals are similarly designed and what they have in common based on the Bible. And then also what was to be eaten in Eden. There'll be a discussion on what was the food source and what did God design the food source to be in Eden. And then what does dominion mean? You might have heard that word before. And then how humans are to treat animals based on all of this teaching in the Garden of Eden. And so starting out, in Genesis 1 to 19, God creates the sky and the earth with all of its vegetation. That's in the verses 1 through 19. And then in Genesis 1:20 to 25, God creates the animals. And then after that, I want to focus on, now this might be a little bit laborious at first, but I want to sort of make a point with it. But there's this Hebrew word, nephesh, it's nephesh, and that's what we're going to sort of focus on here for the next couple minutes. But it's very important, and I want to make this clear about how important this is. There's this sort of important theological link between humans and animals, and it actually shows a sort of equality between humans and animals. It's the word nephesh, and it's sort of been lost in translation, unfortunately, but it's very centrally important. And starting out, the first animals are created in Genesis 1:20. It states, "Then God said, 'Let the waters teem with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth in the open expanse of the heavens.'" And in Genesis 1:20, where it says creatures, living and then creatures, that word is nephesh. It's that Hebrew again. That's important. And then we go to Genesis 1:21, and God created the great sea creatures and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarmed according to their kind, and every winged bird according to its kind. And so again, Genesis 1:21, that's that word nephesh. It's translated as creature, living creature. And then Genesis 1:24, it states, "Then God said, 'Let the earth produce living creatures according to their kind, livestock and crawling things and animals of the earth according to their kind,' and it was so." And that Genesis 1:24, it says living creatures. It's that word creatures according to their kind. Creatures is that word nephesh that's translated in English to creatures again. And then Genesis 2:19 to 20, it states, "And out of the ground the Lord God formed every animal of the field and every bird of the sky, and brought them to the man to see what he would call them. And whatever the man called a living creature, that was its name." And so again, Genesis 2:19, it says a living creature. Backing up here. Yeah, a living creature is how nephesh is translated. Yeah, that's the whatever the man, and a living creature, that's the word that is translated from nephesh to English. And then we go to Genesis 1:30, it says, "And to every animal of the earth, and to every bird of the sky, and everything that moves on the earth which has life, I have given every green plant for food," and it was so. And then in Genesis 1:30, we again have that word nephesh, but it's translated to which has life. That's how that word nephesh is translated. And then here's the important part, actually. In Genesis 2:7, it states, "Then the Lord God formed the man of dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living person." And what's interesting is that Hebrew word nephesh, or nephesh, when it is applied to humans, it says, "And the man became a living person." And so there's a little bit of this discrimination about how animals and humans, how the word is translated, even though the word is the same, nephesh. When it comes to animals, it's usually translated as creature. But then when you get to humans in Genesis 2:7, it says the man became a living person. And so that's really it's interesting that that happens. And what that means too, it's sort of this nephesh is this designation for personhood. That's what that means is humans and animals both have this nephesh. It's this designation of personhood. And we can even see this within scholarly articles. Like it states here, Jacob, this is a scholar speaking, it says, Jacob concludes with the observation that nephesh, in its primary sense, is best translated as person, rooted in bodily reality. And then there's the source too, if you'd like to look at it. But basically, it indicates that animals are persons, and we can conclude that. The Hebrew word for person is nephesh. And so the conclusion we can make from that is that, let me just pull this up. Animals are persons. That's what we can conclude from the nephesh word. Animals are persons. And then with nephesh, that's sort of expanded upon in the New Testament as well. In 1 Corinthians 15:45, and I'm going to transition here a little bit too to say what nephesh, it means person in its sense, but it also has a little bit of an expanded connotation as well in the New Testament, and I'm going to jump into that a little bit. But basically, in 1 Corinthians 15:45, it states, "So it is also written, the first man, Adam, became a living person. The last Adam was a life-giving spirit." And so in 1 Corinthians 15:45, Paul is basically referencing Genesis 2:7, and he's repeating it within 1 Corinthians 15:45. And in the Old Testament, it's written in Hebrew, and the New Testament's written in Greek. And so the translation, you sometimes have to look at the words because there's an equivalent word that's used in the New Testament that it's not obviously the same as the Old Testament, but it's referencing it, and it's equivalent word choice. But the Greek word that is used in place of nephesh, where it says Adam became a living person, that Greek word is psychen. And so that Greek equivalent word for nephesh is psychen. Greek word for person is psychen. And then the Hebrew nephesh is equal to the Greek psychen. Those are equivalent word choices in the Old and New Testaments. And that word psychen, actually, it's interesting because there's another sort of understanding of what personhood is sort of expanded upon within the New Testament about what that means. And in Matthew 10:28, we see this. It says, "And do not be afraid of those who kill the body, but are unable to kill the soul, but rather fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell." And that word psychen, which is equivalent to nephesh, it's translated "kill the soul." Soul is the word choice there for nephesh, or for psychen. And then it's used again in James 5:20. It states, "Let him know that the one who has turned a sinner from the error of his way will save his soul from death and cover a multitude of sins." And so again, that word psychen is translated to soul. And so what that means too is that that's sort of the word soul that's used. It's sort of the word for immortal soul. It is the word for immortal soul. And it's that sort of essence of yourself that lives outside or lives inside your body, but also has an eternal sense. And so what we get from that notion is that nephesh or psychen, the equivalent, the Greek word for immortal soul is psychen. And so what we can gather from that is because humans are both nephesh and psychen in the New Testament, that means that animals also are nephesh and psychen, since those words are equivalent for each other. And so that Greek word for immortal soul is psychen. So that means that animals have immortal souls. And so that's what's really important to note in the biblical sense, is that animals also possess a soul just like humans. And so humans and animals are both persons, but they also possess this sort of immortal soul notion. And we can see that too in later verses of the Bible. It talks about in Isaiah 11:6-9 and 65:25 about how animals are present on the new earth when Jesus returns and creates the heavenly state, that animals are present. And so we can see that aligns with the notion that animals have immortal souls. And so those are animals from our current earth that are resurrected on the new earth. And then we can see that too in our modern language, because person and soul have sort of a close link with one another. Like, for instance, in the nautical sense, if you ever hear like a captain on a boat, he'll say there's a certain number of souls on board, and that really means person. Or and then also in airplane, pilots, they'll say there's a certain number of souls on the plane, and so it's sort of this nautical sense too of personhood and soul. They have an overlap between each other, and that's exactly what the Bible teaches as well. That humans and animals both have a personhood, but also a soul with it as well. And then with that, we're going to transition into, with the Garden of Eden, now that animals and humans, we've established that they both have souls, or they're both persons. A lot of times people will jump to, when you start talking about the Garden of Eden, the most famous passage is dominion. So in Genesis 1:26-28, that's where God creates humans and then gives them dominion over the animals in the earth. And that word, that's commonly used all sorts of words to be grievous. Like, a lot of Christians will say, oh, it means domination, or it means we can do whatever we want to animals with impunity. And I'll show you about how that's not really, that's not accurate at all, actually. And that's because, in Genesis 1:26-28, God gives humans dominion over animals. But then in Genesis 1:29, this is a context that's often skipped. It says, and God said, behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And so we get this indication that dominion in Genesis 1:26-28, in context, the very next verse talks about how humans are only to eat plants. And that might be a little bit confusing the way that Genesis 1:29 is worded. But it's basically, I've given every seed, and then also every fruit is essentially what it's saying, and you will have them for food. And a lot of times when the biblical language is a little bit confusing in the modern translations, I like to go to the contemporary English version, which makes things a lot clearer in our modern understanding. But basically in Genesis 1:29, the contemporary English version, it states, I have provided all kinds of fruit and grain for you to eat. And so this notion of dominion in Genesis 1:26-28, Genesis 1:29 says you can only eat fruit and grain. And so it's this notion that obviously animals were not designed to be food in the beginning. And so the point is dominion. It's associated with this vegan diet. That's what's important, is that humans were created to have dominion over animals, but that dominion involves a strictly vegan diet. And then we can see this in later passages too. It's not just one verse. In Genesis 2:9, it states, and out of the ground the Lord God made to spring up every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. So again, there's this notion that the trees are what is good for food. And then in Genesis 2:16, we have again, and the Lord God commanded the man, saying, you may surely eat of every tree of the garden. And so again, it's this notion that the vegetation, or the fruits, are what is supposed to be the food for man. And then finally in Genesis 3:2, it states, and the woman said to the serpent, we may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden. And so again, it's this idea that God created the trees or the fruits to be the food in Eden. And that's that notion of veganism. And then a lot of people will say, well, was it just backing up to Genesis 1:29 in the CEV, it says, I've provided all kinds of fruit and grain for you to eat. And a lot of people say, well, we're just supposed to eat fruit and grains then? Is that all God provided for us, was just this sort of fruitarian-esque? And I think that's an error, because when we read a little bit further, it establishes, it says in Genesis 1:30, and to every animal of the earth, and to every bird of the sky, and to everything that moves on the earth which has life, I have given every green plant for food, and it was so. And that word, which has life, that's important to distinguish there, because it's obviously talking about the animals. But then in Genesis 2:7, it says, then the Lord God formed the man of dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living person. So humans also have that breath of life. And so in Genesis 1:30, it says, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food. And so, again, humans are given the green plants for food, but primarily the fruits and the grains. But what we can conclude from that is humans were to eat primarily fruits and grains that could supplement with green plants. But regardless, it was only vegetation that was the intention in Eden. That was really the establishment, is that God created humans to be vegan and only eat fruits, grains, green plants, only vegetation. And that's a very traditional understanding too. In the early church fathers, ever since the beginning of really Christianity and Judaism, it's been understood that the Garden of Eden was vegan, and that's not just some modern understanding. Even the most conservative sources, for instance, this website, this is from a very conservative source. They state, yet God clearly said in Genesis 1:29-30 that both men and animals were to eat only vegetation. This was certainly part of the creation being very good, and that was God's best for his creation. And there's the link to that as well, if you'd like. Um, and so a lot of people will point out and say, a lot of critics will say, well, it doesn't specifically say that you can't eat meat. It doesn't say that, meat is not meant to be food in Eden, or it doesn't specifically say that meat is condemned. And we see this established later on that meat was definitely off of the menu. We can see this within Romans 8. It shows Romans 8 is Paul referencing Eden and talking about how basically animals and humans were created immortal. And we see this in Romans 8:20. It states, against its will, all creation was subjected to God's curse, but with eager hope. And so in Genesis 1-2, God creates humans and animals in this paradise. And then in Genesis 3, that's where Adam and Eve disobey, and then the curse is established upon them in all of the earth. Everything is cursed. And so what's associated with that curse after Adam and Eve sinned? That curse is associated with, in Romans 8:21, the creation looks forward to the day when it will join God's children in glorious freedom from death and decay. And so God's curse in Romans 8:20 is associated with death and decay in Romans 8:21. And it's distinguished here too that the creation, that's obviously referencing the animals, and then God's children, that's obviously humans. And so there's this very explicit point that there was no death and decay within Eden for both the animals and the humans, because there was no death and decay because that was part of the curse. And so reading backwards in Genesis 1-2, there was no such thing as death and decay for the creation, which is animals, and God's children, which is humans. And then Romans 8:22 continues on about the result of the curse. It says, for we know that all creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. So this is saying that the curse also had groaning, or this notion of pain. And so there was no pain in the Garden of Eden, nothing to cause pain. And then Romans 8:23, we believers also groan, even though we have the Holy Spirit within us as a foretaste of future glory. For we long for our bodies to be released from sin and suffering. And so again, there's this notion that the curse brought sin and suffering. And so in Genesis 1-2, there was no sin, there was no pain, there was no death, and there was also no suffering. And so what we can gather from that, continuing on Romans 8:23 too, we too wait with eager hope for the day when God will give us our full rights as his adopted children, including the new bodies he has promised us. And so we'll talk about that next week, about how the Garden of Eden, it is going to be remade when Jesus returns into the new earth. And so there's this particular notion, that's really the crux of the Bible, is that paradise will be restored in the future. And so we can look at what Eden looks like, or what Eden looked like based on what the new earth will look like. And so within that, we can see from Romans 8 that animals were immortal. And so when people say, well, it doesn't explicitly say that meat was off the menu, well, later on, it is pretty explicit that animals could not be food. The animals were immortal in Eden, just like humans were. And so meat was most certainly off the menu. There was no meat in Eden because there was no death and suffering for animals. And so meat could not be something that was within Eden. And that's a very traditional understanding too. A lot of early church fathers, a lot of traditional Christianity has established that the Garden of Eden, there was no such thing as animal death. And we can see this also in a pretty orthodox quote. It says, God gave our first parents the food he designed that the race should eat. It was contrary to his plan to have the life of any creature taken. There was to be no death in Eden. The fruit of the trees in the garden was the foods man's wants required. And that's from Ellen G. White in Spiritual Gifts, Volume 4. So that's a very traditional understanding that animals could not die within Eden and certainly were not food. And then, the question then we ask is with dominion, then, if animals were not meant to be food or could not die, if death was impossible, obviously that would exclude meat and fur from Eden. Anything involving death for animals was impossible in Eden. But could humans use animals in Eden for other purposes like work or transportation? That's sort of a matter of debate. And that all depends on the question of what dominion means. In Genesis 1:26 to 28, again, we're going to go back to dominion and sort of talk about what does that mean within the Bible. When God says you have dominion over animals, what is the notion of that? Are animals meant for humans? I'm sorry, yeah, are animals created for human use? Can we use them for our benefit? What is this notion of dominion that God is talking about in Genesis 1:26 to 28? And I'm going to establish about what that means exactly if we take the entirety of what the Bible means and what that means for our relationship for animals. And within Genesis 1:26 to 28, it says, "Then God said, 'Let us make man in our image after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth.' So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created them, and God blessed them, and God said to them, 'Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth.'" And a lot of people, especially critics of my understanding, will say, well, dominion here is associated with subdue, because it says fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish and the animals. And that also is an error as well, because these are two separate distinctions, because it says be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. And so it's saying subdue the earth. So that means the properties of the land, like the mountains, the hills. God wanted to subdue, or, sort of press down, subdue, or, calm sort of these like wild parts of the world is probably in the indication here, like the hills and the mountains, and, flatten them as needed, or, flatten plants or anything like that sort of is in the way, and, foster it for a more peaceful existence for humans and animals. And then it says dominion over the fish of the sea. And so obviously dominion does not mean subdue. That's a very important distinction there. And dominion in Genesis 1:26 to 28, it comes from this word, the Hebrew word radah. And that word can have violent connotations depending on how it's used, but it obviously inherently does not mean violence or inherently mean that, exploitation. And so we can look elsewhere in the Bible to sort of determine what God means by dominion based on this context. And we see within Psalm 72 is a very important distinction about what dominion means exactly. And we can see from the context what God means. But in Psalm 72:8, it's repeated, that same word, radah. Psalm 72:8 states, "May he have dominion from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth." And so that word dominion again is repeated from Genesis 1:26 to 28. And this is talking about a ruler. And then from this psalm, we can gather exactly what is meant by dominion. So we see in Psalm 72, 1 to 2, "Give the king your justice, O God, and your righteousness to the royal son. May he judge your people with righteousness and your poor with justice." And so this word dominion in Psalm 72:8 is associated with the context, Psalm 72, 1 to 2, righteousness and justice. Those are important distinctions, or important associations. And then Psalm 72:3, it says, "Let the mountains bear prosperity for the people, and the hills in righteousness." And so dominion in Psalm 72:8 is associated with prosperity and righteousness. And then Psalm 72:4, "May he defend the cause of the poor of the people, give deliverance to the children of the needy, and crush the oppressor." And so dominion is associated with defending the poor, giving deliverance to the children of the needy, and then crushing the oppressor, or those who would try to oppress those who are under the rule, or should be stopped. And then Psalm 72:7, I think probably most importantly, associates dominion with, "In his days may the righteous flourish and peace abound till the moon be no more." And so Psalm 72:7 makes very explicit that dominion is associated with peace abounding. And then that continues in later parts of the psalm. It states here in Psalm 72, 12 to 13, "For he delivers the needy when he calls, the poor and him who has no helper. He has pity on the weak and the needy, and saves the lives of the needy." And dominion there is associated with delivering the needy, the poor, him who has no helper, having pity on those who are weak, saving their lives. And then Psalm 72:14, from oppression and violence he redeems their life, and precious is their blood in his sight. And so precious is their blood. That's another way of saying this king or this ruler values those who are under his rule. Their blood is precious, meaning he doesn't want it to be spilled. He wants them to endure or keep their lives. And then he redeems them from oppression and violence, meaning that ruler prevents them from having oppression and violence, or he saves them from oppression and violence. And then Psalm 72:16, may there be an abundance of grain in the land, on the tops of the mountains may it wave. May its fruits be like Lebanon, and may people blossom in the cities like the grass of the field. And so dominion has this connotation with blossoming or prosperity and abundance of grain. And then Psalm 72:17, it states, may his name endure forever, his fame continue as long as the sun. May people be blessed in him, all nations call him blessed. And so with dominion, there's this notion of blessedness and throughout the psalm, righteousness, justice. And what that means, what dominion means really in Psalm 72, it's really establishing this sort of dominion over animals is meant to be very benign or helpful to the benefit of the animals. It means that a ruler or leadership that is righteous, just, defends those who are not privileged, pities the weak, delivers the needy, stops the oppressor, brings prosperity and peace. And so with that understanding, dominion is meant to be very benign, helpful to the benefit of the animals. And then we can also give another picture of what dominion means too within Psalm 72, because a lot of times the Old Testament, it prophesies something that's going to happen in the New Testament or further than that. But it says Psalm 72:1, give the king your justice, O God, and your righteousness to the royal son. And so the king, who is that? Who is this talking about? This is obviously talking about Jesus. It says, give the king your justice. The king of kings is Jesus in Revelation. And then it says, give your righteousness to the royal son. And who is the royal son? In Isaiah 9:6, it says, a son was given to us. And so this is obviously talking about Jesus, the son of God. And so this whole prophecy is about Jesus and how he, what would he have to say about dominion? Since this is connected with Jesus, we can see this in how Jesus thought of dominion, or what was going on in his mind when he thought of rulership. In Luke 22:25-26, Jesus talks about what dominion really means. And he's being a little bit sarcastic in here, so I'll sort of work you through it. But it says, Luke 22:25-26, Jesus told them, quote, in this world, the kings and great men lord it over their people, yet they are called friends of the people. And so he's being sort of sarcastic here, because he's saying the kings and the people in charge, they're tyrannical. They lord it over the people, and yet they call themselves friends. And so they're not really being friends with their rulership. And then here's the most important part. Jesus says in Luke 22:26, but among you it will be different. Those who are the greatest among you should take the lowest rank, and the leader should be like a servant. And so what Jesus thought of dominion was this idea of not tyranny or humans or the ruler dominating those who are under his rule, but this idea of a public servant, or someone who is going to serve those who are under his rule. And we can see that within dominion in Genesis 1:26-28. That's really the purpose, is that dominion means that humans are to be servants of the animals, and animals really shouldn't owe us much in return. And so a lot of times Christians will say, well, animals were created to serve humans, and they have that completely backwards. Based on dominion in Genesis 1:26-28, humans were created to serve the animals. That's really the intention. And we can conclude that conclusion, humans were created to serve animals. That was what God created humans for in relation to animals. And so this notion of transportation or using them for work is really not the correct mindset that God had in mind. God had in mind that humans serve the animals, not animals serve the humans. And then we'll say, like, well, what do there's obviously a mutual relationship. Surely animals owe humans something in return. What would be the purpose of animals? They weren't just to be served by humans, right? And there's we can add a little bit more to that with it speaks in Eden in Genesis 1-2, but Genesis 2:19 specifically, it says, so the Lord God formed from the ground all the wild animals and all the birds of the sky. He brought them to the man to see what he would call them, and the man chose a name for each one. He gave names to all the livestock. Or I'm sorry, in Genesis 2:20, he gave names to all the livestock and all the birds of the sky and all the wild animals. And so when we read that, a lot of times, even when I was younger, I would read that and think like, oh, I guess Adam, he named the animals based on species, like horse or pig or cow, or, God wanted us to like him to be like Linnaeus and sort of classify the animals. And that's sort of our modern understanding getting in the way. It's not really the understanding of the Bible about what naming means. And it's a lot more significant than that. It wasn't just to name them by species. And we see this too. And later on in the Bible, um, we see the meaning of naming in Genesis 17:5. God is talking to Abraham here, and he says, "What's more, I am changing your name. It will no longer be Abram. Instead, you will be called Abram. I'm sorry. For instead, you will be called Abraham, for you will be the father of many nations." And so, God is naming or really renaming Abram to Abraham here, and that sort of has this notion of significance or importance, especially friendship. That's another thing. Is God isn't being tyrannical over Abraham; He was elevating him and calling him significant for a reason. And so naming him is implied to be this sort of this friendship or the significance. And then again in Genesis 17:15, not long after, God said to Abraham regarding Sarai, your wife, her name will no longer be Sarai. From now on, her name will be Sarah. And so within this again, God says to Sarai, your name is no longer this; it's Sarah. He's renaming or naming Abraham's wife and telling her that you're significant, you're a friend, you're someone that is important to me. And then Genesis 32:28, God says here, your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel, for you have struggled with God and with men and have prevailed. And so there's this understanding as well here, even though God and Jacob wrestled, it's this notion that Jacob, you are important to me, you are significant, you are my friend, you are someone that has value. And then even in the New Testament, we see, Jesus is God. And so, Jesus is one with the Father. And so in John 1:42, looking intently at Simon, Jesus said, your name is Simon, son of John, but you will be called Cephas, which means Peter. And so Jesus is naming or really renaming Simon to Peter. And so with Jesus and Peter, we can see that with their relationship, that there was this significance, this importance, very much a friendship, very much a designation of importance for Peter. He led the church after Jesus died. And so it's a relationship of significance. And when we name someone, other persons, that means that they are significant, they are important to us, they are someone who is our friend. And that's really the notion of this, is that the only thing that dominion means for animals about, what do animals owe us in return as God designed it, is that we can conclude, animals were created to be friends to humans. And that's really this notion within the Garden of Eden. And sort of in summary, dominion, God creates the humans and the animals. It says, humans, you have dominion over the animals. And then we can only eat plants, and we couldn't use them really as resources, but they were meant to be our friends, and we were supposed to take care of them. And so when we serve animals, when we have friendship with the animals, we're really living out God's creational intent. And that's really what God, he says in Genesis 1:31, after everything he created in the Garden of Eden, he called it very good. And so when we serve animals and when we designate them as our friends and treat them with kindness and avoid exploiting them, God calls that very good. And so that's sort of the end of my teaching. We can go into Q&A if everyone's ready. That's next week. I'm going to focus on too the new earth, which is, I sort of alluded to that earlier, but the Garden of Eden is the new earth is a recreation of the Garden of Eden. In Isaiah 51:3, it talks about that, as well as several other passages. I think it's Ezekiel 36:35, about how the Garden of Eden will be restored in the end of time when Jesus returns. And so I thought it was appropriate next week to talk about how the Garden of Eden will be restored in the future, and then what that will look like as well, and what we can learn from the new earth, and how that also can dictate our relationship towards, or inform our relationship with animals here and now. And then since this is the first episode, of course, it's not without technical difficulties. So we're just we're just moving through determining our next steps here. Just bear with us. Okay, and then I see a question came through. Revelation 22:14. I'll have to familiarize myself. It looks like it was from Elsie Masson, I think is maybe how you pronounce it. But she said, "What do you think of Revelation 22:14?" Let me pull up that passage. I think I know which one that is. Let me just pull it up. Hold on one second. Revelation 22:14. It says, "Blessed are those who wash their robes, so that they may have the right to the tree of life, and that they may enter the city by the gates." And that actually has an important understanding for what we're talking about here with the Garden of Eden. That has an obvious connotation. This is repeated a lot through the Bible, and that the Garden of Eden will be reestablished or brought back down to earth. Um, and you see that within Revelation 22:14, that they may have the right to the tree of life and go through to the gates into the city. And that's talking about, that's a reference actually to Revelation 22. That the whole chapter is actually about the establishment of Eden, because we see in Revelation 22 the Garden of Eden being reestablished, and then there's that tree of life as well. There, it says, "The angel showed me the river of the water of life, bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb, through the middle of the street of the city. Also on either side of the river, the tree of life, with its 12 kinds of fruit, yielding its fruit each month. The leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. No longer will there be anything accursed, but the throne of God and of the Lamb will be in it, and his servants will worship him. They will see his face, and his name will be on their foreheads. Night will be no more. They will need no light of lamp or sun, for the Lord God will be their light, and they will reign forever and ever." And that's the Garden of Eden being reestablished, as Revelation 22:14 also talks about. Um, is that we'll be wearing robes, we'll have the right to the tree of life again, and then it'll be an entire city actually this time. Um, and then let me see here if there was any other questions. Um, yeah, and if anybody has any other questions, just let me know. You can put them through the chat. Yeah, and while we're I'll wait for any questions, but I can talk a little bit too about some of my writings, if anybody's unfamiliar with it. I wrote "I Will Abolish the Bow" um, back in, it was during the pandemic actually. That's when I got a lot of it thought out and through. But I had the inspiration for that too, because there wasn't really a lot of commentary on that establishment of that word nefesh and what it means. Um, so I wrote a lot about that, about how this is really important and this has been lost in translation about the word nefesh. That was what "I Will Abolish the Bow" was a lot about. And then it was also about, since we have this understanding of, animals are this nefesh or this personhood, that should really change how we see them or how we treat them. And so then I established what's known as, I was sort of working from the ground up about, because people would ask me at festivals like, well, what does rights of animals mean, or what do you mean by animal rights? And I didn't really have like a clear answer for them. And so in that book, I sort of established that rights had three different principles, and that I saw in the Bible, which was Jesus's teaching of treat others the way you want to be treated, the golden rule. And then there was also the be the servant of all, and so animals should be served and not exploited. And then also with that, there's this idea of harmony or peace between humans and animals that God desires, and we see that obviously in Genesis 1 as well as Isaiah 11, and that's how God wants the world to function, is this sort of peace and harmony between humans and animals. And then I tackle also common rebuttals to what I was talking about. A lot of I will abolish the bow is that. And then Pride Goes Before Destruction, I also wrote. Um, and then going back to Elsie Mason, too, she had read the NKJV Revelation 22:14 completely. And I guess that one might be a little bit different, is what she's telling me. It says here, I see Revelation 22:14. Blessed are they that do his commandments, that they may have the right to the tree of life and may enter in through the gates into the city. And you're right, there is actually a sort of a difference there. I wasn't familiar with that version of the verse. I know the other um, translations of that in Revelation 22:14. It almost always says, "Blessed are those who wash their robes." And I'm guessing the KJV they're probably taking a more literal version of that, which is like obviously they're not washing their robes. What does that mean? I think that means those who aren't sinning, or those who have accepted faith in Jesus. I'm not really familiar with what that means, but it says, "Blessed are those who do His commandments," and so that might be one interpretation of that verse. And Jesus also says, um, you know, "Those who love Me will do My commandments," and so that probably has something to do with following the teachings of the Bible to some degree. And I think that probably answered your question. Yeah, and then also, "Pride Goes Before Destruction" was my other book. I talk about that. I'm sorry, I wrote that throughout 2021 and 2022, and then it got published in 2023. Both "I Will Abolish the Bow" and "Pride Goes Before Destruction" were published by Whitman Stock. But "Pride Goes Before Destruction," I was talking to a lot of Christians and realizing that the root of what I was thinking about when I address problems, a lot of times I like to go to the root of it. And what I kept hearing a lot of it was, well, we can do this to animals because we're better. We can do this to animals because we're more important, yada yada. And it's sort of this pride was that I was noticing. Like it was sort of this, I can't accept treating animals as equal because I think I'm more important than them. And that book sort of focused on how when we have this overwhelming and enormous pride towards animals, how it ends up affecting us as well. And so a lot of Pride Goes Before Destruction focuses on, because we're not treating animals with a little bit of humility, or even what the Bible sort of paints as how we should treat them. This is why we're seeing so many negative effects like climate change, pandemics, antibiotic resistance, all of these different things that are associated with our um, awful treatment of animals. Um, and then I also wrote Meet the New Cigarette. That one is a focus on, when I used to work in the hospital, actually, I would notice that when whenever we would have a patient that was a cigarette smoker, if they would like smoke in the hospital, they were immediately discharged, or they were, told very, very assuredly that there was no smoking. There was no policy that allowed smoking in the hospital, and it was very, very strictly mandated, and for good reason, because of cigarettes, the obvious health risks, and then there's also fire hazards and things like that. And that was managed by what's known as the Joint Commission. That's a regulatory body for hospitals that dictates their um, what their hospital should function like, and it's a series of stipulations that if you follow them, then you can get accredited, and Medicare will reimburse you as a hospital. So it's really an accrediting organization. And I had the idea of, what we do with an accredit, or what we do with stipulations towards cigarettes in hospitals. Why couldn't we do that with meat? And so basically, that whole book is a plea for the Joint Commission to ban or regulate meat within hospitals. And so that's where it gets into the health aspects of. They said that their rule for cigarettes was because of the obvious detrimental health effects. And so I thought, well, meat also has a lot of very detrimental health effects. And so what can we do to move that towards being banned or shunned within hospitals? And I thought that was a really important um, book for establishing um, why we need to pay closer attention to what we're feeding patients. Um, let's see here. And then I got another question here. It says, there are a growing number of Christian vegans in the world. How do you envision the forthcoming vegan world um, within the church? Forthcoming vegan world within the church. How do I envision it? Well, I think I'm not particularly optimistic about the church really adopting veganism. I think that there's great potential. I mean, it's possible as time goes on. I think that the more that we can push veganism. I think it'll become sort of a norm, but I think that the way that the curse functions and the way that human nature is sort of right now, I don't see meat disappearing completely. I can see it maybe being sort of like cigarettes, like sort of taboo or sort of something that's criticized or not or maligned. But I think as the world, especially with climate change, and I know like Denmark, they just passed a like a sort of a nudging where they're going to try to make a lot of food that they import or push to be plant based. And you can see this within a lot of governments is that I think the world is going to become more plant based. I think that meat will always have some sort of um, place, but I think that as the world progresses, I think that lab grown meat has a lot of great potential. If people can get their meat without harming animals, I think that would probably be the best solution. But I think that humans, as we see, are probably a little bit too stubborn to ever sort of fully embrace the ideal. But I think within the church, I could see definitely a lot of liberal churches sort of adopting veganism and expecting that to be the norm. But I think that as we progress, I definitely can see meat becoming something that is not the dominant feature of plates that it is right now. And but that's at least how I envision it. I could be wrong. I don't know. It's hard to say. It's like a lot of Christians address that question of slavery. Is would slavery? We've seen slavery abolished legally, but yet slavery still exists in the world in the forms of human trafficking, and it's something I think that's always going to be with us is slavery. But that doesn't mean that we have to make it legal or something that we should support. I think it always is going to have a place, but we can try to minimize it as much as we can, and not make it legal or something that is supported by the church or by God or by our legal system. And I think meat maybe has the same. Is that we can try to suppress it as much as we can. I think that's an appropriate response. But to think that we can banish it, I think completely is maybe a little bit too optimistic. Just like and if people they're willing to put cigarettes in their mouth, which we all know is extremely toxic and destroy their bodies, then they would do the same with meat, obviously. And then any other questions that anybody had too? Yeah, and then feel free to, like I said, this is a joint collaboration between all creatures, and so please, all creatures is such a great resource too because I know when I was first starting out as vegan back in 2016, and I was really looking to see like what does Christianity or what does my faith have to say about this because I wasn't extremely familiar with the arguments, even though they were pretty obvious. But all creatures was a really great resource for me. My friend Trey as well has also found all creatures to be extremely helpful with the sheer volume of resources, and there's virtually nothing in the Bible that hasn't been untouched by all creatures as far as what it has to say about animals. And they have a lot of different writers, a lot of different resources that can help with that. And then I had another question come through. Oh, you know what? This is actually a really great. I'm really glad someone asked this because this is something I'm going to focus on in the coming weeks. That's going to be very in depth and detailed, but I can go into a short sort of understanding of it. Teresa asked, "Okay, how do you address those who believe we will sacrifice in the millennial kingdom?" And that's really a matter of interpretation. And I would say so. There's four different interpretations of the Bible, and especially as it relates to eschatology, which is like the end of things, how the world will conclude or how the world will end. And the four different understandings are there is what I would consider my understanding, and I think is the correct view because I've studied this so much. There's amillennial and postmillennial. Those are I float somewhere between those two. I always say, on a good day, I'm a postmillennialist. On a bad day, I'm an amillennialist. And those are both sort of Christ returns. The millennium is now, which means that millennium that the Bible talks about in Revelation 20 is happening right now, and then Jesus will come back after that 1,000-year millennium. And 1,000 years isn't literal because there's a lot of times in the Bible where 1,000 years is said to be like, oh, God says I own the cattle on 1,000 hills. That doesn't mean that there's just 1,000 hills and then God owns those. It means every hill. And so 1,000 is non-literal. And so when Jesus comes back, there's this idea that there will be animal sacrifices. But again, it depends on interpretation. Amillennial and postmillennial believe that the millennium is now. And so those animal sacrifices that are discussed in the Old Testament, like, oh, Jeremiah 33:18 says something about my priest will never lack. I Ezekiel, or I'm sorry, yeah, Jeremiah and Ezekiel both talk about animal sacrifices being reestablished, but then the New Testament interprets that and says, well, no, those are spiritual. Like in 1 Peter 2:4-5, it says, make your, or Romans 12:1, it says, make your bodies a living sacrifice to God. 1 Peter 2 talks about how the sacrifices are spiritual sacrifices. And so that's really how those passages should be understood, is that those prophets wrote that thinking, this is what I understand about what sacrifices mean. But then the New Testament reinterprets that and says, no, those are spiritual. Those are spiritualized, and then it gets extremely sticky too. Like in Ezekiel, it says, I think in 46:12, it says the sacrifices that will be reestablished are for atonement. And so that gets really sticky, because then in Hebrews it says that Jesus atoned for all sin now and forever. And so why would sacrifices be reestablished for atonement if Jesus already atoned for all sin? It's sort of like slapping Jesus in the face. And so, and what his work accomplished. And so those are obviously meant to be understood as non-literal. And I think the New Testament makes that very clear, especially with several passages. And then it's also a debate about, the temple being reestablished or the temple being restored. That's also discussed in the New Testament, because Jesus is the temple. And so the temple is talked about being reestablished in Ezekiel, but then Jesus says, tear down this temple and I will rebuild it in 3 days. And he was talking about his body. And so his body is the temple, and as well as all of us, we're all the temple. The temple became spiritualized after Jesus resurrected. And so, will there be future animal sacrifices? Absolutely not. I would say the Bible makes it very clear in the New Testament that the temple is figurative and the sacrifices are now spiritual as well. And really, the only interpretation that makes that a plausibility is premillennial dispensationalism, which I think is actually a completely erroneous way to interpret the Bible. And that's actually a very modern interpretation of the Bible. It really didn't start creeping up until like the late 1800s. There's I think maybe one early church father that had an idea of premillennial dispensationalism, and virtually no one else. The church has almost always understood amillennialism, postmillennialism, and a little bit of historic premillennialism as well. Those are the four interpretations, but the three, premillennial dispensationalism has almost never been recognized by early church fathers or traditional orthodoxy. And today, actually, most Christians are premillennial dispensationalism, which I think is completely erroneous. I would actually even argue maybe borderline heretical, as a lot of Christians have noted. There's actually an article that a Seventh-day Adventist wrote about the sevenfold errors of dispensationalism, and one of them is that animal sacrifices will return, which is never something that was ever thought by the early Christians community to be something that would happen. And suddenly it's a teaching that most Christians think is going to happen, and I don't think there's a lot of support for that. And Teresa, you mentioned too about how the scrolls in Ezekiel are not in order, and I remember you said that on Facebook too. And I'm curious to know. It makes a lot of sense. I haven't seen any like scholarly articles about that, but it wouldn't surprise me. I'll have to dig into that more. But like I said, I'll dig into that millennial sacrifices. That's something that I talked extensively about in "I Will Abolish the Bow" and "Pride Goes Before Destruction," about what that means, because that's something that I deal with a lot. A lot of lay Christians don't really know that argument, but a lot of Christian scholars and a lot of theologians and people that have very big and important ministries have that sort of understanding. And a lot of stuff online that's a lot of premillennial dispensationalism have that notion, but I don't think that has much support in traditional or Orthodox Christianity. And then if anybody else had any questions, just let me know. Like I said, next week is going to be about the new earth. And so that's probably my two favorite teachings within the Bible, is Genesis 1 and Isaiah 11. And I'm going to dig into that more next week. Next week's going to be Isaiah 11, Isaiah 65, Hosea 2, a lot about what the new earth is like. And that's always a very positive message. And then, but I want to let you know, I was talking about too, allcreatures.org, about how they were a tremendous resource for me as an early Christian vegan. And I think, if you haven't checked out their website, yeah, definitely. If there's ever, I've actually consulted them numerous times in my books as well, because I wanted to see what other scholars have thought about a certain passage or something like that. And Tams is actually the executrix, so she'd be happy to answer any questions too. And then our ministry is also Christian Animal Rights Association. That is we're a non-denominational ministry, and we work a lot with advocacy and legislation. And so feel free to follow us on Facebook and Instagram. And then another question came through. It says, "Did you cover the supposed sacrifice to cover Adam and Eve?" That was post-fall, so I didn't cover that, but I will definitely get into that in future weeks. No, I can address it briefly, of course, but in Genesis 3:21, that's where Adam and Eve sacrificed an animal, or I'm sorry, no, there was supposedly an animal sacrifice, and then their skins covered Adam and Eve. And there's been a lot of scholarly debate about what that means. Like I've seen rabbinic commentary. Actually, no, I'll read the passage just so everybody's familiar with it. But it says Genesis 3:21. The Lord God made for Adam and for his wife garments of skins and clothed them. And a lot of Christian scholars have argued that, well, there was obviously meat because skin was lying around, and so Adam and Eve were covered with that skin. And I would argue that that's probably a wrong interpretation. I've seen a lot of rabbinic commentary that says something about Adam and Eve were beings of light, and so then they were covered with skin, and they didn't have skin before that. And I don't know if there's a lot of support for that either, because then it talks about on the new earth how we're going to have resurrected bodies, and so we obviously had bodies within Eden, so that never made any sense to me. To me, I think the most obvious or the most logical conclusion from Genesis 3:21 is that this is probably the first animal sacrifice, because right before this, in Genesis 3, I think it's 3:6, they have the fall, and then right after that is the curse. And part of the curse, it says, till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken, for you are dust, and dust you shall return. And so obviously this means animal and human death, because Ecclesiastes 3:19, it talks about how animals and humans are both created from the dust. And so they return to the dust as well, because they were created immortal. And so with the curse, animals also die. And so I think this is the first animal death. And Adam and Eve sinning, this is a way to temporarily atone for their sin. I think that probably makes the most sense. And this is obviously not a good thing. This is after Adam and Eve's disobedience. This is after they were kicked out of the garden, or I guess they were, on their way out of the garden. And so I think this was the first animal sacrifice. I don't think it was anything that was, that this was obviously not something that was good. This was the first animal sacrifice, which was then obviously tolerated for a season throughout the Old Testament, and then the New Testament makes clear that Jesus ended animal sacrifice, and sacrifices became spiritual. And then hopefully that addressed that question. But like I said, I'll dig into that in the coming weeks. I'm going to dig a lot into what the purpose of animal sacrifice was. Why did God, allow animal sacrifices? And obviously that was for a season. It was a trajectory on the issue, it was tolerated for a season, eventually abolished. And then, there's our website, obviously. And then allcreatures.org too. I'm sure we'll be happy to share that as well. But, and if anybody had any other questions, please let me know. If not, I'm very happy to present this to you. I hope it was very helpful. I really enjoyed teaching this, so I'm happy to have the opportunity. Thank you for allcreatures.org for the opportunity, and thank you, Tams, for conducting the teaching. And then, like I said, next week we're going to talk about the new earth, so I'm excited for that. And I think that that's probably all for this week. And then I look forward to next week teaching about the new earth.